We are happy to have today Father Francis Clooney of Harvard. Most of you have had a chance to hear him in the past. He's been a friend of the Vedanta Society now for about 4 decades at least. And so many of you know him. He's a senior professor of Comparative Theology and Hinduism. He first taught for many years in Boston College, and since last 17 years he's at Harvard. Personally, I've had a honor to be his friend and have him as my friend for more than 3 decades. And I've learned a lot from him, and as all of us have learned a lot over the years, that he has shared his wisdom. And so today he will speak with us on the mystery of Mary, reflections on Immaculate Conception. Please welcome Father Clooney.
Good morning, everyone. So I am indeed happy to be with you today. I think the first time I came to the center to visit was simply to meet Swami Sarvagatananda in 1987 or so. And then he invited me to give a Sunday sermon maybe in 1988, 89. Then he would come to BC and I would come back and so on. And then I met Swami in Chennai, in Mylapore. I used to bicycle over to the mutt to meet him there. And we had wonderful conversations. And I prophesied that he would be the perfect Swami for Boston. And lo and behold, Bellar Mutt heard the word and sent him here. So it was a long and wonderful occasion, and good to see so many of you again. You may hear that my voice is a little bit shaky. Once in a while I start coughing. I have a pocket full of cough drops and plenty of water here. So forgive me if at any point I start coughing and so on. I think because I am a friend of Swami and wanted to do something that would fit the occasion, I decided that since it's December 8th, I would pick up the Catholic feast that we have on December 8th, namely the Feast of Mary's Immaculate Conception. And this is a feast that I'll explain in a few moments, but it's actually one of the mysteries of the Catholic faith to say that Mary, the mother of Jesus, herself was conceived without sin, and that from the moment of her conception in the womb of her mother, she was a holy person, a pure person, a person given over to God, and that somehow that is a teaching that is important to understanding who Jesus is. It's not an easy teaching to understand, and this is not a classroom, so I will not go into too much detail, but try to make some sense of it for you today, and we can talk about it afterwards as well. So the Immaculate Conception is an important feast. It was declared by the Pope in 1854 to be a doctrine, a dogma of the Catholic faith, that Mary was conceived without sin, having been debated for 1,000 years or more by theologians, yes, no, maybe, who knows. The Pope declared in 1854 that it was part of the faith to say that Mary was conceived without sin. Even before that, in 1846, for reasons I've not yet been able to understand, the bishops of the United States said that the patron saint of the United States is Mary, the Immaculate Conception, which isn't what you would expect necessarily, but nonetheless that was done well over 150 years ago. And there have been many occasions and apparitions of Mary. One of the most famous is at Lourdes in France. Some of you may have been to Lourdes. And there, Our Lady is said to have appeared to a young girl, 14 years old, Bernadette. And when she appeared to Bernadette, and then appeared to her again and again and again and again, she said, "I am the Immaculate Conception." And it was a very kind of powerful teaching for popular use to say that Mary herself is saying to the people, "I am the Immaculate Conception." The piety is still around. The old Jesuit church in South Boston, where Boston College was founded, Boston College High School was founded, was the Immaculate. Our Lady of the Immaculate Conception. The church is gone now, but for 150 years, that was the church in that area. You can see. There are also parishes in Revere and Everett dedicated to the Immaculate Conception. And today, in the Catholic Church, is what's called a Holy Day of Obligation, that Catholics are expected to go to Mass on this day. And since today is a Sunday and Catholics are expected to go to Mass on Sunday, tomorrow is a day when Catholics are expected to go to Mass. So it's not an unimportant feast, but it is one that is somewhat difficult to understand. So let me try to explain to you, and then try to explain why it matters, how this can matter for us. We know certain things about Mary from the Bible, from the New Testament. The beautiful hymn with which we began is one of the most important, where the angel Gabriel comes to Mary and speaks to her and says, "Good news for you, you shall be the mother of the Lord." And Mary is puzzled and said, "How can that be?" And the angel says, "Don't fear, you are the chosen one, God has come upon you, you will be the mother of the child." Obviously, the birth of Jesus, prophecies in the temple, when King Herod tried to kill the baby, Mary and Joseph and the baby went off to Egypt, it says, and then came back. And then Mary is sort of on the borderline during the life of Jesus. There's a famous and beautiful story when Jesus begins his ministry. He's invited, along with Mary, to a wedding in the small town of Cana. And they go to this small town for the wedding. And when they're halfway through the feast, Mary comes up with an important problem, a dilemma that is to be solved. She goes to Jesus and says, "Look, they're running out of wine. How can they have a wedding feast unless they have wine?" And so Jesus says, "What is it to me? I'm not a winemaker." But then because he wants to honor what she does, he does a miracle and turns water into wine. A kind of unusual story, but seems to show the love that Jesus and Mary have for one another and the love for the ordinary people. Mary is there at the cross of Jesus when he's dying on the cross. She's there at Pentecost when the Holy Spirit comes down upon the church. So there are certain scenes when we know about Mary from the Bible, but there's always curiosity, as I think with any great saint of any tradition, what else about their lives should we know? And so, for instance, there are stories in the pious tradition, but not in the Bible, about the birth of Mary. When she was born, of Anne and Joachim, her father and mother, what was her birth like? And there are old stories that you can still hear today if you go to Jerusalem about Mary grew up in the temple. So when she was 3 years old, it says she wandered into the temple and refused to leave, and that she wanted to be in the holy place. This is not in the Bible, but nonetheless a long tradition. And also the story of what happened to her when she died. And it seemed that she was given the gift of choosing when she could die, and that at the end of her life, she sort of surrendered herself into God's hands and then passed away. And then the belief that her body was taken up into heaven. And again, this is not in the Bible, but nonetheless, it's a beautiful teaching that she was so pure, so holy, so much given over to God, that God sort of reached down and took her up and brought her into the heavenly place. There are even pictures you can see. If we had a big screen here, I could show you Mary, Queen of Heaven, and that all the angels gathered, all the saints gathered, and Jesus putting a crown on the head of Mary. Some people would say this is all, fanciful, the imagination, but I think it shows kind of the great devotion that many Catholics have to the Virgin Mary. And one of the great mysteries is the one that I'm talking to you about today. How is it that Mary was born as such a pure and holy person? How is it that she was somehow blessed from birth? 9 months before, she was conceived in a holy fashion. She was conceived in a holy way. And that's what the Immaculate Conception means, that there is no macula, the Latin word for like a stain or impurity or imperfection, but that she was conceived in a way that somehow destined her to this holy life. So I don't think it's so much a matter of saying that everyone else is a sinner, but rather that Mary, in some special way, there was grace upon her from the very beginning, and that she was called to a life of grace even from the instant when she was conceived in her mother's womb. And this is a very beautiful teaching because it really talks about why are we the kind of people that we are? How do we become the people we are? How far back does it go in our own lives, in our families, in the lives of our parents, in the lives of those who go before? And there's a teaching in the Catholic Church called original sin. And it's not so much to blame the little baby who's born and say, there's a sinner, but rather to say that clearly anyone born into this world is born in some way into a very troubled world. We know this. We don't need any proof of this. But we can see that there may be various physical imperfections. Sometimes babies are born with one problem or a health problem or another health problem. Some babies need surgery soon after they're born. Some babies are born into families where there are problems. The parents may be very poor. They may be living in a dangerous place where there's a war going on. There may be disease and famine around. The father and the mother may not actually live together. They may break up. And a sense that the world is not a good place in so many ways. And that when we are conceived and brought into the world, we're innocent, we've done nothing, and yet somehow the world around us is dangerous, and a world that can be threatening to us. And so the teaching about the Immaculate Conception seems to be saying that all of that is true, and that Mary, when she was conceived in the womb of Anne, it's not that she was somehow protected with a shield, like nothing could happen to her, but rather to say that she would be protected and drawn through life because she had a mission. She was the one who would, as we heard in the hymn, to whom the angel would come. And the angel would come, the angel would call upon her and say, "Young woman, you are called to be the mother of God. You are called to be the Holy One." And somehow a destiny that even though the world around her might be in a very dangerous way, the Romans had conquered Israel, there were evil kings, there were people ripping off the poor, there were people who were suffering, obviously, and that somehow in the midst of all this, she would be one who is protected. She would be one who would be holy, whatever happened to her in her life. So there's a sense of the original destiny, that if Mary is the one who could hear the angels speak, and then without any preparation, without saying, I'll get back to you tomorrow, let me think about it for a while, immediately has the courage to say to the angel, yes, what you say, I will agree to. And that kind of sense of how did this young woman, maybe 14, 15 years old, how did she suddenly have that courage to agree to a great mystery and to say yes to it and keep it in herself? The belief is that not only from her birth, but from the very beginning of her existence, when she was conceived in the womb, there was somehow a sense that she would be the brave one, the pure one, the courageous one, who would always say yes to God. And I think that is really what we're talking about today. Not that she is not human, or not that she's a superwoman, but that she's the one that in the circumstances of her life would say yes to God no matter what happened. This, of course, is a teaching we have about Jesus himself, that he was God on earth. And even though he could do miracles, according to the Gospels, such as turning water into wine, or opening the eyes of the blind, or helping the deaf to hear, even raising the dead, nonetheless, in almost every way, he was just like everybody else. He wasn't, again, a superboy. He didn't become a superman, but was like other people. There are beautiful passages in the New Testament about Jesus, which I think then can be extended to talk about Mary. In the letter to the Hebrews, one of the last books in the New Testament, it says, "Therefore Jesus had to be like his sisters and brothers in every way." so that he might be a merciful and faithful friend to them in service of God, that he might give himself for them and protect them and help them. Jesus himself was tested by all that he suffered, so that he could help those who were being tested. In the sense that not a Jesus who came into the world, I've never suffered. Nothing has ever gone wrong for me. I am perfect in every way, as if he didn't know what sickness was, or he didn't know what tiredness was. He didn't know when things could go wrong, but that except in sin, because he always kept his faithfulness to God, he was always going to be the person who would say yes to God, but then in every other way. He had to get up in the morning, he was hungry, sometimes he may have had a headache, he had all day long things to do. All of that was true for him like for anyone else. Or as it says in chapter 4 of Hebrews, we do not have a friend and a protector who is unable to sympathize with our weaknesses, but rather we have one who in every way has been tested as we are, but without sin. So in every way, even temptations, even tests, Jesus is like everyone else. Therefore, we can approach the throne of grace with boldness because we have a friend there, somebody who understands what is happening to us. And I think that the logic of the Immaculate Conception is to say, well, if that's true of Jesus, then that's true of his mother as well. And that Mary must have been that kind of person who didn't say, I am the Holy One, I am the Virgin, I am the Mother of God, and therefore, keep away from me. But rather that she was the one who, again, understood the hardship of being pregnant, of being a mother. We hear the story that when she was getting ready to bear the baby, the Romans demanded a census, that everyone had to go back to their village. So riding on a donkey probably, Joseph took Mary as a very due woman all the way to Bethlehem because he had to register there. And she knew what it was like to be in fragile health. She knew what it was like to be discomforted. She knew what it was like to have to flee to Egypt with the baby. So all these things were true of Jesus and therefore true of Mary as well. Now, if this was a classroom, I would have more, I would assign readings and give you things to think about before class. But what I've said so far is very pious and very, I think directly true about the holiness, the health, the graciousness of God poured out on Jesus, but also on Mary. But the tradition, 1,000 years plus of theologians sitting at their desks and pondering and wondering about all this, said, how could Mary be holy from her conception? Because the Catholic teaching and the Christian teaching in general is that holiness is guaranteed for everyone through Jesus and through Jesus who died on the cross. So technically speaking, everybody who's come into the world before Jesus is somehow waiting for the holiness of Jesus, is waiting for Jesus to give himself in love, for Jesus to die on the cross for them. And then the holiness is poured out. So the question arises, if Mary was conceived, obviously, 15, 16 years before Jesus was conceived, and then maybe some 35 years before he died on the cross, how could she suddenly be holy from her conception? Doesn't it mean that she didn't need Jesus? She didn't need him to die on the cross? She was so special that she's the one person who didn't need Jesus? And they didn't want to say that. They wanted to say that the love of God poured out in Jesus applied even to Mary. And this is the hard part that really, I think maybe would understand better if we had a sense of karma and rebirth, actually. That what happens to us now is affected by what happened in the past. And that karma can go in both ways. It can go to the past, it can go to the future. But in the Catholic tradition of Europe, it was a hard thing to say. Let's say if Jesus died on the cross in the year 33, then how could it be maybe 45, 50 years before that his mother was conceived without sin. And one of the great theologians of the Immaculate Conception, again, this will be on the quiz that I'll give you later, John Duns Scotus. Scotus means that he was a Scot from Scotland. He was a priest, he was a Franciscan monk, and he was the one who kind of thought deeply about the Immaculate Conception in the 13th and 14th century. And he's one of the great defenders of it. And his teaching is very technical. It's all these volumes, and I haven't read them all, so I can't tell you about them, luckily. Don't worry about that. But he said we're thinking about it the wrong way. We're thinking about that Jesus came into the world to save the world from sin. And that suppose Adam and Eve had never sinned. Suppose there was never Eve taking the fruit from the serpent and eating it. Suppose Adam had not taken the fruit from Eve, and then suddenly there was no problem and they stayed in the Garden of Eden. Many theologians said then there would have been no incarnation. There would have been no Jesus coming into the world because he came to put things back in order after the sin of Adam and Eve. And therefore, if there was no sin, then there would be no need for salvation, and story over. The Bible would be very short. So what John Duns Scotus said, actually, that is looking at the mystery in such a negative way. It's looking at it as if the only reason that Jesus came into the world, the only reason the Son of God was born in the world, was to put things back together and patch things up and make things right after things went wrong. But he said that's the wrong way to look at it, because he said it makes more sense to say that from the beginning of the creation of the world, why do you think God created the world? God didn't create the world that things would go wrong or that things would fall apart and then the Superman would come down from heaven and put them back together. But God planned from eternity that God would come into the world as Jesus and God would bring divinity into the world around us. And so it only secondarily had to do with sin and problems and the wickedness of the world, but that even if Adam and Eve had stayed in the garden, the Son of God would have become human. So it's actually a very beautiful teaching if you think of it. And there are many versions that you're very familiar with that we could compare it with. But to say that the reason in the Christian tradition, the Jewish tradition, in the beginning, God created heaven and earth. In the beginning, God said, let there be light. All of this was because God had a plan to make the world, in a sense, divine. That God would come into the world would be divinized, and that we who are human, and then I think we might say here, and all animals and all plants and all reality would be caught up into the mystery of God and, in a sense, become divine. And that even if everything was perfect, it would be made more perfect by God coming into the world in human form. So it's a very beautiful teaching that really says that the great mystery of life begins with the mystery of God's love. And that before there is sin, before there is forgiveness, before there is judgment or anything like that, in the very beginning, God said, let there be life. Why? Because I love the world. Let there be human beings, let there be all living beings. Why? Because I want them to be filled with grace. Let the world be a place where people can find their way, can be healthy, can be happy, can live in the presence of God. So it's a very beautiful teaching. And John Duns Scotus then said, therefore, if the incarnation wasn't God looking down at the world and saying, oops, things are going very badly down there, I better do something about it. God the Son, please go down and fix things. If God had always had in mind to make the world kind of this divine living place where all beings could be in God, then he says it's logical to say that God knew that therefore from the beginning there had to be a mother of the baby. There had to be a mother of Jesus who would come into the world. And therefore, from before the beginning of the world, there was a plan that there would be Jesus, the Son of God, Son of the Father, and that there would be a mother of God, the mother of Jesus, who would also be pure, would be holy, would be given over to the will of God in order to make divinization possible. So Jesus didn't just like fly down, but that like every other baby conceived in the womb, 9 months in the womb and then born, there had to be a mother who was ready to do this. And his view eventually won the day, that having had this negative view that it's all about sin and judgment and forgiveness, the church began to change its mind and say, actually, that's a more beautiful way to look at it. That in the beginning and from the beginning, God loved the world, and because of that love, wanted the Son to come into the world, and because of the Son coming into the world, wanted there to be the mother. And this idea that even before somebody exists, God can be with them and God on their side and God planning, which again, we Christians don't have a place really for believing in reincarnation. We could talk about that some other time, I suppose. But there is a sense that even before we exist, God is already thinking about us. Even before conception, before birth, before we have parents, before we have names, God is thinking about us. And this is a beautiful passage I thought might be appropriate from the prophet Jeremiah, one of the prophets of Israel, who had a really hard time because the message given to Jeremiah was to remind the people that if they continued acting the way they did, everything was going to fall apart. And there'd be what was called the Babylonian exile. The Babylonians would come, the Assyrians would come and drag them off in slavery. So he was the one prophet that nobody liked, because people wanted to hear the word of God, but they didn't want a word of God that was negative. They wanted just good news. And Jeremiah said, I'm sorry, before the good news, there has to be the bad news. You've got to change your lives if you really want things to go well. But in any case, at the beginning of the book of Jeremiah, there's this beautiful reading where Jeremiah talks about himself and his experience, saying this, and this is a quote, "Now the word of God came to me and said to me, before I formed you in the womb, I knew you. Before you were born, I consecrated you. Before you even existed, I appointed you a prophet to the nations." And that seems to be, I take it, in the spirit of what happened with Mary. Before you were conceived, before you were named, before anyone else ever thought of you, before your parents thought of you, I, God, have from all eternity had you in mind, had you in my heart. And if this is true of Jeremiah, before I formed you in the womb, I knew you. Before you were born, you were consecrated. The logic of the Catholic teaching about Mary was the same thing. Mary, before you were in the womb, I knew you. Before you were conceived, you were already holy. In that sense, again, I think that time is not a one-way thing. And that time exists, there is time, but so before time, after time, there is this kind of consciousness of God, or this love of God that overflows and makes sense of time. So what's true of Jeremiah seems to be true also, according to Catholic logic, of Mary as well. Now I was thinking another way to think about this, maybe less complicated, I hope you're not getting headaches from my remarks so far, is to say that another logic is children are so much influenced by their parents. Now, it's not predictable saying, if you have good parents, therefore you'll be a good person. Or if you have parents who are neglectful, then you will be neglectful. We can't say anything so obvious as that. But there is a way in which all of us, and I think of my own childhood, growing up in New York City, about how loving my parents were. And many of the virtues of my parents kind of carried over to me. That it would make sense to say, well, if Jesus was this kind of person who was generous and loving and caring, he must have had parents like that. Parents who showed him how to do this. We could talk about Joseph another time, but Mary seemed to be the kind of person who would influence how Jesus was. And for this, I did the one comparative part of my paper. I decided to go to the great master, the life of Ramakrishna, Saradananda's beautiful book about Ramakrishna. And I went to the beginning, which I don't think I had actually read very carefully before, about the parents of Ramakrishna. So Kshudiram and Chandra Devi, or Chandramani, or simply Chandra, the influence of them on their child, and you probably all know this very well, but I'll go through it a little bit, is that they're not saying that Ramakrishna was the avatar, the porn avatar. He wasn't himself only because of his parents, but that every day of his early life, they were there showing him the way. They were there showing him how to be the kind of person he was. This is chapter 4 of the first book of the Great Master, and it's entitled The Experiences of Chandra Devi. So it's a whole chapter dedicated to Chandra Devi, Chandra, the mother of Ramakrishna. And it starts by saying, I can't resist reading this to you, the unique spiritual experiences and visions of the parents of great souls who sanctify the earth by their birth are always recorded in the sacred books of all races. For example, this has been done in the case of the parents of divine personages like Ramachandra, Sri Krishna, Buddha, the son of Maya Devi, Jesus, the son of Mary, Shankara and his mother, Chaitanya and his mother, and of course Ramakrishna and his mother. Now, is it really written in all the books? Again, I told you, I confessed to you earlier, that the story of Jesus doesn't tell us a lot about Mary in the beginning, but the sense of the child is to be understood in terms of the mother. It then goes through these examples at length and says, before Jesus was born, already his mother Mary understood that she was going to be the mother of this child. And the experience she had was that she was filled with spiritual radiance, that she had never been seen or felt before, and she realized that this radiance was a sign that the child was within her. And then she realized through the word of Gabriel the angel, this is somehow God coming to birth within us. Then the chapter goes on, as you might expect, to talk about imagining what it was like for Chandra to be the mother of the baby who became the great Ramakrishna. It's something to think about. We talk about the great deeds and the great teachings and all the disciples of Ramakrishna, but when he was a very small child, when he was breastfeeding, when he was learning to walk and learning to talk, Kshudiram and Chandra were there. And the sense that he himself, although he was destined to great things, was already influenced by them in terms of who he was. And so he goes on to say, and I won't read all of this, that basically to understand the holy person, it makes sense to understand their mothers too. There may be exceptions, but nonetheless, that's good advice. So we come to know through sources the parents of every great person whose life we are to write about. We learn about their mothers at the time of their birth, their spirit experiences of their mothers, and so we need to tell you about Chandra Devi. And so the chapter goes on maybe for 20 more pages, and I promise not to read 20 more pages to you. But I do want to read one section, is that Kshudiram realizes that his wife is an unusual person. She's always having visions. She's always having mystical experiences. And at one point, it seems to become embarrassing, like the neighbors are saying, what's she doing? How can she be always having these experiences? And Kshudiram actually tells her, these experiences are very beautiful, but only talk about them to me. Don't tell anybody else. And I think he wants to quiet her down. But you think of Sri Ramakrishna himself and the ability to somehow experience God in all things and the ability to kind of experience the holiness of everything. It seemed to be partly perhaps picked up from his mother, Chandra Devi. And there's this beautiful section here, and I'll just read you this paragraph, and I think I won't read any more paragraphs. So Kshudiram realized that Chandra, who always loved as her own all the children of the neighborhood, now felt a particular motherly love even for the gods themselves. She looked upon Raghuvir, the family deity, as her own son. She looked on the goddess Sitala and the emblem of the god Rameshwar as her own children. And so there's this kind of sense of this generous, growing motherhood that even before Ramakrishna was born, she saw herself as having this kind of mothering quality locally for the children in the neighborhood, and even, as I just read, for the gods and goddesses. That somehow everything was her children. Nothing was outside her family. And I think her son would have picked this up from her. And so it goes on to say, formerly her heart always used to be filled with awe and fear and the time of service and worship of the deity. So going to the temple very solemn and being very kind of, careful that you don't do anything wrong up to that point. But somehow this love, perhaps when she was already bearing the child within her, now the force of love completely replaced any feeling of awe or fear. Any idea of fear or hesitation in her approach to the gods vanished. And now she had nothing to hide from them or to ask them. Instead, there came the assurance that the gods and goddesses were even closer to her than her own children. An intense desire to sacrifice herself to make them happy, an ecstasy of being bound to them in an eternal relationship. So this could be talked about, much more, but a sense of her and her sense of her unity with the world around her, her ability to take the gods and goddesses into her family, seems to be, again, not solely, Ramakrishna as a little baby and little boy was like taking notes or something, but this idea that nothing spiritual is outside my experience. No God, no goddess, no teaching, nothing is out there, like I don't understand that. And when Ramakrishna himself, when he comes to the temple in Dakshineshwara and becomes the priest, how quickly he goes from doing the daily rituals to somehow experiencing Kali there, seemed to be something that I think his mother understood perfectly. And by the way, do you know that she lived already all the way into the 1870s? So a good bit of his life, she was still around, and he was present at her death. So the ability of her to say, I recognize in my son something of myself, I think is a very beautiful idea. And this idea that, again, Mary was a special person. Mary had this grace. Mary had this ability to somehow experience God. All of that seems to be of the same feel, that as the child, so the mother. And that the holiness, the generosity, and the love of a Jesus, the love, the generosity of Mary as well. So I recommend reading this to you, but I won't read any more. But I think it makes sense then, again, to ask the simple question, as we sang in the hymn at the beginning, how is it, what would you do if you were a 14-year-old girl in a small village in Palestine or in India or whatever? How would it be if an angel appeared to you? And the angels, Gabriel and Raphael and Michael, are often these fearsome figures with holding swords or blazing in light. And when the angel came to her, at first she did ask, how can what you're saying to be that I will be the mother of God possibly happen to me? How can this come about? But once the angel says, Mary, don't worry, the Spirit of God will come upon you, what does she do? She says, yes. And it's like she plunges into the mystery and simply says, I don't understand this. I don't really know what you're talking about. But I do want to say that I trust that you are a messenger of God, and that somehow all her life had been a preparation. All her existence from the time she was conceived in the womb was a preparation to be there, and when the angel came to her, without fear to say yes. And I think that's very beautiful, that everything in our lives too, is somehow a preparation for those moments when God speaks to us. That we not turn away, we not start bargaining, we not hide our heads, but we say yes. And that Mary is an example of that. And that Jesus himself, then, who was able in his life to say yes to what God gave him, even at the end of his life when he was in the garden and knew that his death was coming, he said, he prayed to the Father, Father, please take this away from me. I don't want to die this death, but if it is your will, then I say yes. And perhaps he got that from his mother, that her holiness, her lack of fear, her love overflowed in his life as well. And I won't read it, but then the only long passage we have of Mary is when she goes up into the hills outside of Nazareth, because the angel had told her cousin Elizabeth is also going to bear a child in her somewhat elderly age, which might have been 35 or 40 in those days, who knows, the one who would be John the Baptist. She goes, despite the fact that she's now pregnant, she goes to be there with Elizabeth during the last 3 months of her pregnancy to help her. maybe to cook the food, to clean the laundry, to help her to get ready for having the baby. But she gives a beautiful teaching, which in Catholic tradition, Christian tradition, is called the Magnificat. And many of you sure know this. A long kind of prayer in which she praises God for what God has done. And I'll just read you a little bit of it. So after Elizabeth says to her, when you came here, the baby in my womb started dancing. And that somehow John in the womb of Elizabeth recognized the Jesus who's in the womb of Mary, and these two mothers kind of looking at each other, and the babies in their womb kind of recognizing one another is a very beautiful thing. But she says, my soul magnifies the Lord, praises God greatly. My spirit rejoices in God my Savior, for he has looked upon the lowliness of his servant. From now on all generations will call me blessed. The Mighty One has done great things for me, and holy is his name. And I think that's really enough of it. It's very beautiful to read, and you can read the rest in chapter 1 of the Gospel of Luke. But rather to say this, I praise God, I give myself to God, because God is the one who has looked upon me in my nothingness and filled me with love, filled me with the Spirit, lifted me up, and made me somebody who will now be known by all, including us today. The Lord has done great things for me, therefore holy is his name. And again, I think the logic of the Immaculate Conception is not kind of a very arcane teaching that we can just put aside, but realizing that the gift of grace is older than we are, and that God's love for you and me is a love that's there even before we were conceived in the womb. And that somehow Mary recognizes this, and seeing her cousin Elizabeth, the two of them with their children in their womb say, glory to God. God has lifted us up and made something out of us. I'm almost at the end, and my voice seems to still be there. I want to read you a little bit. So in 1854, Pius IX, one of the great popes, a long reign in the 19th century, he declares this to be a teaching of the Catholic Church, and declares this to be a teaching that is to be believed by all Catholics everywhere, hence the feast. And on this date, December 8th in 1854, by tradition, Mary was born on September 8th. So count back 9 months, you get to December 8th. And this is just a little part of his long letter explaining this. From the very beginning, and before time began, the Eternal Father chose and prepared for his only begotten Son, a mother in whom the Son of God would become incarnate, and from whom, in the blessed fullness of time, the Son would be born into the world. So again, even before time began, God had this loving plan. Above all creatures did God so love her, that truly in her was the Father pleased with singular delight. So God delighted in Mary even before she was conceived. Therefore, above the angels and above the saints, so wondrously did God endow her with the abundance of all heavenly gifts poured out from the treasure of his divinity. Like she becomes this vessel of heavenly gifts, like she's being filled with the divinity of God. Absolutely free from sin, all fair and perfect, that she would live all her life with a fullness of holiness and sanctity, than which under God no one can imagine anything greater. So that's sort of the core of his teaching. Mary was this not big person on her own, like patting herself on the back, but rather saying God loved her from before the beginning of time and filled her, and we want that to be part of Catholic teaching. Immaculate Conception. Let me close with 2 more points. One is, what about you and me? So I don't think I was immaculately conceived. No discredit to my mother, but I think I've been imperfect all my life. And perhaps most of you may feel the same about your parents also. Loving relationship, but not blind to any imperfections or whatever. But that it tells us, when we live in a wicked world, and we live in a world where there's great trouble, and you just read the newspapers, go online, every day there was woe in the world around us, to remember that the fuller story is that grace comes first. That no matter how much violence there is, or selfishness, or hatred in the world around us, God's plan is that love will win out, that justice will take place, that holiness will defeat the evil of those who are violent. and to train ourselves, read the newspaper, live in the real world, but say the realer world is to read the newspaper in light of God's love and to look at the things around us with an eye, not simply optimism, but a sense of hope that God's love will triumph for all. And then to ask ourselves individually, if you think back, to your earliest childhood memories, how far back in your life can you go and remember that God has always been there? God has been caring for you. That's why we're here today. That somehow God's mystery has touched us from the very beginning of our lives. And to practice that by remembering and going back as far as we can, and then thinking, thankfully about our parents. Thinking about our parents and the love they showed. They may be imperfect, but nonetheless, we are who we are in part because of how our parents cared for us and loved us. And those of you who are mothers or fathers, you can also think about the challenges and the gifts that you bring to your family, ways that you've helped your family to grow, care for your children, and so on. All of this, I think, we're invited to, and to see then that being immaculate is not some kind of a lofty ideal of perfection, where I can be the perfect person, or I want to be perfect and I always fail, but like Jesus, who's like to us in all things but sin, like Mary, that all of us, the point is not to be perfect, or not to be without flaw, or not to never have any suffering in our lives, but in every situation to be able to say, God's grace comes first. God's holiness comes first. God loves us even as we are and comes to us. Why? Because us too. God knew us and called us by name even before we were conceived in the womb. So I'll finish by reading a short passage from one of my favorite poets, a Jesuit poet, no surprise, Gerard Manley Hopkins, one of the great poets in everybody's eyes of the 19th century. Soon after Pius IX had declared this mystery, the Immaculate Conception, he writes a poem dedicated to the Virgin Mary. It's a very beautiful poem. It's a very long poem. I promise not to read it to you. The Virgin Mary compared to the air we breathe. Just think about the title, that somehow air permeates. It's inside us, it's outside us. The meditation Swami led us in at the beginning, paying attention to breathing in and breathing out. And somehow Mary is like that air, that somehow she is this presence of grace, the aroma of grace, the fragrance of grace in and out of our lives. I think he's trying to get at that feel for what Mary is if you have faith. And this is just a little part of it. And then I'll sit down. I say that we are wound with mercy round and round, as if with air. The same as Mary, more by name. Mary, wild web, wondrous robe, mantles the guilty globe, since God has let dispense her prayers his providence. Nay, more than the almoner, the sweet alms self is her. All people are meant to share her life as life does the air. Thank you.